Chapter 3. The Garden of Eden. The Genesis Code. Enter the Dark Lord. The Flower People. Science and religion agree that in the beginning, the cosmos moved from a state of nothingness to the existence of matter. But science has very little to say about this mysterious transition, all of it highly speculative. Scientists are even divided on whether matter was created all at once or whether it continues to be created. By contrast, there was remarkable unanimity among the initiate priests of the ancient world. Their secret teachings are encoded in the sacred texts of the world's great religions. In what follows, we will see how a secret history of creation is encoded in Genesis, that a few over-familiar phrases can be opened up to reveal extraordinary new worlds of thought, mighty vistas of the imagination. And we shall see, too, that this secret history chimes with the secret teachings of other religions. In the beginning there precipitated out of the void nothing but a matter that was finer and more subtle than light, then an exceptionally fine gas. If a human eye had been looking at the dawn of history, it would have seen a vast cosmic mist. This gas or mist was the mother of all living, carrying everything needed for the creation of life. The Mother Goddess, as she was sometimes also called, will metamorphose in the course of this history and assume many different forms, many different names, but for now the earth was without form and void. Now for history's first great reversal of fortune. The Bible narrative continues, "Darkness was upon the face of the earth." According to biblical commentators working within the esoteric tradition, this is the Bible's way of saying that the Mother Goddess was attacked by a searing dry wind that almost extinguished the potential for life altogether. Again, to a human eye, it would have looked as if the gently interweaving mists that had first emanated from the mind of God were suddenly overtaken by a second emanation. There was a violent storm, like some rare and spectacular phenomenon observed by astronomers, the death of a massive star, perhaps, except that here, in the beginning, it would have been on a completely overwhelming scale that filled the entire universe. So this is what it would have looked like to a physical eye, but to the eye of the imagination, this great cloud of mist and the terrible storm that attacked it can be seen to cloak two gigantic phantoms. Before we try to make sense of this ancient history of the cosmos, or to understand why so many brilliant people have believed in it, it is important to try to absorb it in the form it would have been presented in ancient times, as a series of imaginative images. It is important to let these images work on our imaginations in the same way that initiate priests intended them to work on the imagination of the candidate for initiation. A few years ago I found myself falling into conversation with one of the legendary figures of London's gangland, a man who had helped spring a villain called Frank the Mad Axeman Mitchell from a psychiatric prison, and then, according to the stories, gone a bit mad himself. He killed the Mad Axeman in the back of a van with a sawn-off shotgun, then bathed in his blood, laughing. But his most vivid memory, the one he personally found the most chilling, was also his earliest. He remembered a fight he must have seen when he was perhaps just 2 or 3 years old. His grandmother was bare-knuckle fighting on the cobbles outside her home, among the Victorian terraces of the old East End. He remembered the gaslight on the wet cobbles and flying spittle, and how his grandmother resembled a giantess, lumbering but supernatural in strength. He remembered, too, that her massive forearms, built up and rubbed raw by the washing she took in to help feed him, thudded again and again into the other woman, even as she lay on the ground unable to defend herself. We must try to imagine something similar as we contemplate the two titanic forces locked in combat at the beginning of time. The Mother Goddess would often be remembered as a loving, life-giving and nurturing figure, comfortingly round and soft-looking, but she also had a terrifying aspect. She was warlike, when needs be. Among the people of ancient Phrygia, for instance, she was remembered as Cybele, a merciless goddess who rode on a chariot pulled by lions, and who required devotees to work themselves into such a wild and savage delirium that they would castrate themselves. Her opponent was, if anything, more frightening. Long, bony, His skin was a scaly white, and he had glowing red eyes. Swooping low over Mother Earth, the Dark Lord was armed with a deadly scythe, giving away his identity to anyone who hasn't already guessed it. For if the first emanation from the mind of God would metamorphose into the goddess of the earth, the second emanation would become the god of Saturn. Saturn would trace the limits of the solar system. In fact, he was the very principle of limitation. What Saturn's intervention introduced into creation was the potential for individual objects to exist, and therefore the transition from formlessness to form. In other words, because of Saturn, there is a law of identity in the universe by which something exists and is nothing else, and neither is anything else it. Because of Saturn, an object occupies a certain space at a certain time, and no other object can occupy that space, and neither can that object be in more than one place at one time. In Egyptian mythology, Saturn was Ptah, who molds the earth on a potter's wheel, and in many mythologies, Saturn's title is Rex Mundi, King of the World, or Prince of this world, because of his control of our material lives. If an individual entity can exist through time, then by implication it can cease to exist too. This is why Saturn is the god of destruction. Saturn eats his own children. He is sometimes portrayed as Old Father Time, and sometimes as Death himself. Because of Saturn's influence, everything that lives contains the seeds of its own end, and it is because of Saturn that what feeds us also destroys us. Death is in everything in the cosmos, woven into the bright blue sky, a blade of grass, the pulse of a baby's fontanelle, the light in a lover's eye. Because of Saturn, our lives are hard. Because of Saturn, every sword is double-edged and every crown a crown of thorns. If we sometimes feel our lives almost too hard to bear, if we bruise, and if we do cry out to the stars in despair, it is because Saturn pushes us to our limits. And it could have been worse. The potential for life in the cosmos could have been extinguished even before birth. The cosmos would have remained through all eternity a place of the endless sifting of dead matter. In the course of this history, we will see that Saturn has returned at different times and in different guises to pursue his aims of mummifying humanity and squeezing the life out of it. At the end of this history, we will also see that his most decisive intervention, an event long predicted by the secret societies, is expected to take place shortly. In Genesis, the evil one's attempt to nullify God's plans at birth, the first act of rebellion of a thought being against the mind that emanated it, is dealt with in just one short phrase. But, as we have already suggested, the Bible is not here dealing with a scale of time we would recognize today. Saturn's tyranny over Mother Earth, his murderous attempt to squeeze all potential for life out of the cosmos, continued over vast periods immeasurable to the human mind. His tyranny was eventually overthrown, and Saturn, if not entirely defeated, was kept in check and confined to his proper sphere. Again, Genesis tells us how this came about. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Light was pushing back the darkness that had been brooding over the waters. How was this victory achieved? Of course, there are two accounts of creation in the Bible. The second, at the start of the Gospel of St. John, is in some respects fuller, and it can help us to decode Genesis. But before we can continue to decode the biblical story of the creation, we must deal with a sensitive issue. We have already started to interpret Genesis in terms of the earth goddess and Saturn. Anyone brought up in one of the great monotheistic religions will naturally feel some resistance to this. Surely this polytheistic belief in the gods, of stars and planets, is characteristic of more primitive religions, like those of the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, or Romans. Conventionally minded Christians may wish to stop listening now. Today's church preaches an extreme and radical monotheism. This is perhaps partly because of the dominance of a science that leaves little room for God. In science-friendly Christianity, God has become an undifferentiated and undetectable immanence in the universe, and spirituality is nothing more than a vague and fuzzy feeling of at-oneness with this immanence. But Christianity has roots in older religions of the region in which it arose, and all of these were naturally polytheistic and astronomical. The beliefs of early Christians reflected this. For them, spirituality meant commerce with actual spirits. Christian churches, from the cathedral at Chartres and St. Peter's in Rome to small parish churches all over the world, have been built on the sites of ancient holy wells, sacred caves, temples, and mystery schools. Throughout history, certain sites like these have been regarded as portals for the spirits, cracks in the normal fabric of the space-time continuum. The science of astroarchaeology has demonstrated that these portals are aligned with astronomical phenomena, intended to funnel influx from the spirit worlds at propitious times. At Karnak in Egypt, at sunrise on the summer solstice, a thin ray of sunlight would enter the portals of the temple and travel 500 yards through courtyards, halls, and passageways until it penetrated the darkness of the Holy of Holies. It may surprise some Christians to learn how far this tradition has continued. All Christian churches are astronomically aligned, normally due east on the saint's day to which the church is dedicated. Great cathedrals from Notre Dame in Paris to the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona are covered with astronomical and astrological symbols. Modern churchmen are often quick to condemn astrology, but none can deny, for example, that the great Christian festivals are all astronomically derived, Easter being the first Sunday following the full moon that falls on or follows the vernal equinox, or that Christmas is the first day after the winter solstice, when the rising sun begins to move visibly back in the reverse direction along the horizon. Even a glance at the biblical texts reveals that today's radically monotheistic reading of the Scriptures is out of step with what the writers of these texts believed. The Bible refers to many disembodied spiritual beings, including the gods of rival tribes, angels, archangels, as well as devils, demons, Satan, and Lucifer. All religions believe that mind came before matter. All understand creation as taking place by a series of emanations, and this series is universally visualized as a hierarchy of spiritual beings, either gods or angels. A hierarchy of angels, archangels, and so on, has always been a part of church doctrine, alluded to by St. Paul, elucidated by his pupil, St. Dionysius, codified by St. Thomas Aquinas, and vividly imagined in art and also in literature by Dante and others. These doctrines are often overlooked and disregarded by modern Christianity, but what church leaders have been actively determined to suppress, what has been reserved for esoteric teaching, is that different orders of angels are to be identified with the gods of the stars and planets. Though it hasn't filtered down to the wider congregation, modern biblical scholarship acknowledges that the Bible contains many passages that should be understood as referring to astronomical deities. For example, Psalm 19 says, "He set a tabernacle for the sun, which is a bridegroom coming out of his chamber. His going forth is from the end of heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it." Study of this passage, in conjunction with comparative texts from neighboring cultures, reveals that it describes the marriage of the sun to Venus. A passage like this might be dismissed as incidental to the main theological thrust of the Bible. You might suspect it of being an interpolation from a foreign culture. But the reality is that after layers of mistranslations and other types of obfuscation have been removed, the most important passages in the Bible can be seen to describe the deities of the stars and planets. The 4 cherubim are among the most powerful symbols in the Bible, appearing in key passages in Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Revelation. Popular in Hebrew and Christian iconography, prominent in church art and architecture everywhere, they are symbolized by the ox, the lion, the eagle, and the angel. In esoteric teaching, these 4 cherubim are the great spiritual beings behind 4 of the 12 constellations that make up the zodiac. The proof of their astronomical identities lies in the imagery associated with them. Ox equals Taurus, lion equals Leo, eagle equals Scorpio, and angel equals Aquarius. This fourfold pattern of symbolism regarding the constellations is repeated in all the world's great religions. But for the most important and telling example of polytheism in Christianity, we must return to the story of the creation as it is told in Genesis and the Gospel of St. John. Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 is usually translated as, "In the beginning God made heaven and earth," but in fact, any biblical scholar will admit, even if only when pressed, that the word Elohim, here translated as God, is plural. The passage properly reads, "In the beginning the gods made heaven and earth." This is a rather puzzling anomaly that clergymen outside the esoteric tradition tend to turn a blind eye to, but inside this tradition it is well known that what is being referred to here are astronomical deities. We can discover their identity, as I have suggested, by matching the passage in Genesis with the parallel passage in the Gospel of St. John. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." This parallel is helpful because John did not newly mint the phrase, "the Word." He was referring to a tradition already ancient in his lifetime, and which he evidently expected his readers to understand. Some 400 years earlier, Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, had written, "The Logos, i.e. the Word, was before the earth could be." The important point here is that according to ancient tradition, the Word that shone in the darkness in John's Gospel, and so we now see, the gods who let there be light in Genesis, are the 7 great spirits who work together as the great spiritual influence emanating from the sun. Thus both Old and New Testaments allude to the role of the sun god in creation, as it was generally understood in the religions of the ancient world. The second great act in the drama of creation comes about when the 7-fold sun god arrives in order to rescue Mother Earth from Saturn. In the eye of imagination, the sun is a beautiful and radiant young man with a leonine mane. He rides a chariot, and he is a musician. He has many names: Krishna in India, Apollo in Greece. Arising in splendor in the midst of the storm, he pushes back the darkness of Saturn until Saturn becomes like a giant dragon or serpent encircling the cosmos. The sun then warms Mother Earth into new life, and as he does so, he gives vent to a great triumphal roar that reverberates to the outer limits of the cosmos. The roar causes matter in the cosmic womb to vibrate, to dance and form patterns. In inner group esoteric circles, this process is sometimes known as the dance of the substances. After a while it causes matter to coagulate into a variety of strange shapes. What we are seeing here, then, is the sun singing the world into existence. The sun lion is a common image in ancient art. Whenever it appears, it refers to this early stage in the mind before matter account of creation. A magnificent retelling of the history of the sun lion in the act of creation was written as late as the 1950s. It comes in the prequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, called The Magician's Nephew. Something that non-esoteric schools of literary criticism have missed is that the work of C.S. Lewis is steeped in Rosicrucian lore. In his story, the sun lion is called Aslan. In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. It was very far away, and Diggory, the first child to explore Narnia, found it hard to decide from what direction it was coming. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath them. There was hardly even a tune, but it was, beyond comparison, the most beautiful voice he had ever heard. It was so beautiful he could hardly bear it. The eastern sky changed from white to pink and from pink to gold. The voice rose and rose till the air was shaking with it. The lion was pacing to and fro about that empty land and singing his new song, and as he walked and sang, the valley grew green with grass. It spread out from the lion like a pool. It ran up the sides of the hills like a wave. What the teacher of the mystery schools meant to indicate by the victory of the sun god was the momentous transition from a purely mineral cosmos to a cosmos burgeoning with plant life. In the earliest and most primitive form of plant life, according to the mystery tradition, single germs were joined together in vast floating structures like webs that filled the whole universe. In the Vedas, the sacred books of India, this stage of creation is described as the net of Indra, an infinite net of luminous living threads, perpetually interweaving, coming together like waves of light, then dissolving again. Time passed, and some of these threads began to weave together more permanently, the light streams dividing into tree-like forms. An imaginative impression of what this was like can perhaps be got by remembering what it was like, as a small child, to visit a great hothouse like the ones that Alice Liddell, the girl who inspired Alice in Wonderland, liked to visit at Kew Gardens. Great tendrils stretch everywhere. Here are humid mists and a sunny, luminous greenness. If you were able to land in the midst of all of this, and if you sat on one of the great green branches stretching out of sight, and if this great branch on which you were sitting suddenly stirred, you would have an experience like a hero in a fairy story, sitting on a rock that moves and reveals itself to be a giant. Because the vast vegetable being at the heart of the cosmos, whose soft and luminous limbs stretched to all four corners of it, was Adam. This was paradise. Because there was as yet no animal element to the cosmos, Adam was without desire, and so without care or dissatisfaction. Needs were satisfied before they could even be felt. Adam lived in a world of endless springtime. Nature yielded an unending supply of food in the form of a milky sap, similar to that which we find in dandelions today. Memorials to this blissful satiation have come down to us in statues of the many-breasted mother goddess. As time went on, the plant forms became more complex, more like the plants of today. Again, if you had been able to see this time in the history of the cosmos with the physical eye, you would have been struck by the myriad fluttering, palpitating flowers. We have suggested that the secret history of the creation shadows the scientific history of creation in intriguing ways. We have just seen, for example, how a purely mineral stage of existence has been followed by a primitive plant stage, followed by an era of more complex plants. But there is a vital difference I must draw to your attention. In the secret history, not only is it true to say that what eventually evolved into human life passed through a vegetable stage, but the vegetable element remains an essential part of the human being today. If you removed the sympathetic nervous system from the body and stood it up on its own, it would look like a tree. As one of Britain's leading homeopathic healers put it to me, in a rather beautiful phrase, the sympathetic nervous system is the gift of the vegetable kingdom to the physical body of man. Esoteric thought all over the world is concerned with the subtle energies that flow round this vegetable part of the body and also with the flowers on this tree, the chakras which operate, as we shall see, as its organs of perception. The great center of the vegetable component of the human body, feeding on the waves of light and warmth radiating from the sun, is the chakra of the solar plexus, called solar because it was formed in this, the era controlled by the sun. Awareness of this vegetable element in the human body has remained greatest among the peoples of China and Japan. In Chinese medicine, the energetic flow of this vegetable life force, called qi, is understood to animate the body, and disease arises when the delicate network of energies becomes blocked. The fact that the flow of this energy is undetectable by modern materialistic science, the fact that it seems to operate in some elusive realm between the human spirit and the meat of the animal body, does not make the medicine any the less effective, as generation upon generation of patients attest. As well as in medicine, the Chinese and Japanese tend to lay great emphasis on the role of the solar plexus in spiritual practice. If you contemplate a statue of a meditating Buddha, you will see someone who has gathered himself inward, and at the center of this meditation, his center of mental and spiritual gravity, is his lower belly. This is because he has withdrawn from the rigid, deadly mentality of the brain and sunk down into the center within himself, sometimes called the hara, that is connected with all life. He is concentrating on becoming more aware of being alive, of his unity with all living things. Although the idea of chakras has become popular in the West because of an influx of Oriental esoteric thought, the chakras are also central to the Western esoteric tradition and can be seen in both Egyptian and Hebrew thought. And just as Christianity contains a hidden tradition of gods of the stars and planets, so it also contains a hidden tradition of the chakras. The organs of the vegetable body are situated in nodes up and down its trunk. They are made up of different numbers of petals, the solar plexus chakra, for example, having 10 petals, and the brow chakra having 2 petals. The 7 major chakras, situated at the groin, solar plexus, kidneys, heart, throat, brow, and crown, feature in the 17th century writings of Jacob Boehme, and, as we will see later, in those of his near contemporary, the Catholic saint Teresa of Avila, where they are called the eyes of the soul. Moreover, on closer inspection, the Bible itself can be seen to contain many coded references to the chakras. The horns, with which Moses has traditionally been depicted, are explained away by conventionally minded Christians as the result of a misunderstanding based on a mistranslation. But in the esoteric tradition, these horns represent the 2 petals of the brow chakra, sometimes called the third eye. The flowering rod of Aaron refers to the activation of the chakras, the opening of the subtle flowers up and down the subtle tree. In the final chapter, we will see how in Revelation, the account of the opening of the 7 seals is in fact a way of talking about the enlivening of the 7 chakras and predicting the great visions of the spiritual world that will result. The pineal gland is a small grey gland the size of an almond, which is situated in the brain where the spinal cord reaches up into it. In esoteric physiology, when we have a hunch, our pineal gland begins to vibrate, and if spiritual disciplines are used to increase and prolong this vibration, this may lead to the opening of the third eye, situated, of course, in the middle of the brow. Modern anatomists only discovered the pineal gland in 1866, when 2 monographs were published almost simultaneously by H. W. de Graaf and E. Baldwin Spencer. Later it was discovered that the pineal gland is large in children, and when the crystallization of various body parts happens around puberty, that is to say, when we naturally become less imaginative, the pineal gland begins a process of calcification and also shrinks. Scientists now know that melatonin is a hormone, most of which is produced by the pineal gland, mostly at night. Melatonin is essential for the rhythm of waking and sleeping and the maintenance of the immune system. If modern science discovered the pineal gland relatively late, the ancients certainly knew of it very early on and also believed they understood its function. They knew, too, how to manipulate it to achieve altered states. The Egyptians clearly depicted it as a uraeus snake, and in Indian literature it is shown as the third eye of enlightenment, or the eye of Siva. It was depicted as the pine-cone-topped wand of the followers of Dionysus, and a 4th century BC Greek anatomist described it as the sphincter which regulates the flow of thought. They saw the pineal gland as an organ of perception of higher worlds, a window opening onto the brightness and wonder of the spiritual hierarchies. This window could be opened systematically by meditation and other secret practices, which gave rise to visions. Recent research at the University of Toronto has shown that meditating on the pineal gland, using methods recommended by Indian yogis, causes it to release a rush of melatonin, the secretion that causes us to have dreams, and, in sufficient dosages, can also cause waking hallucinations. Returning to the creation narrative and the great imaginative images encoded within Genesis, we see that Adam's body had at first been very soft and amorphous, his skin almost as delicate as the skin on a pond, but now it began to harden. As the great Christian mystic and Rosicrucian philosopher Jacob Boehme wrote in Mysterium Magnum, his commentary on Genesis, what would in time become bone, now hardened and became something closer to wax. Warmed by the sun, His green limbs also began to become tinged with pink. As Adam solidified, he also began to divide into two. That is to say, he was an hermaphrodite who reproduced in an asexual way. When pressed, any scholar of biblical Hebrew will have to admit that Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, the passage usually translated, "Male and female he created them," properly reads, "Male and female they," i.e. the Elohim, created him, singular. So, it was by this plant-like method of reproduction that Eve was born out of Adam's body, molded from the waxy cartilage which served Adam for bone. The progeny of Adam and Eve also reproduced asexually, procreating by using sounds in a way that was analogous to the creative activity of the Word. This episode in history is related to Freemasonic law pertaining to the word that has been lost, the esoteric belief when, in the far future, this word is rediscovered, it will be possible to impregnate using only the sound of the human voice. Adam and Eve and their progeny did not die, but now and then they merely went to sleep in order to refresh themselves. But the lotus-eating state of the Garden of Eden could not go on forever. If it had done, humanity would never have evolved beyond the vegetable stage. It was always intended that the sun god would separate from the earth for a while. Of course, no artifacts have survived from the time when gods and proto-humans lived in plant form, but there is at least a reliable record of such artifacts. Herodotus, the Greek writer of the 5th century BC, is sometimes called the father of history, because he was the first to try to research and piece together a coherent and objective account of history. In approximately 485 BC, Herodotus visited Memphis in Egypt. There, in vast underground vaults, he was shown rows of statues of former kings, stretching back as far as the eye could see into almost unimaginably distant times. Walking with the priests along the rows, he came to a series of 345 colossal wooden carvings of beings who had reigned before Menes, their first human king. These beings, said the priests, were born one from the other, that is to say, without need of a sexual partner, by the plant-like method of parthenogenesis. Each carrying a plaque giving name, history, and annals, the wooden monuments were a record of a long-lost era of the vegetable life of humankind.